When millionaire Garrett Sullivan reviewed the hidden camera footage from his daughter's bedroom at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, he watched something that destroyed him completely. Not abuse, not neglect, not theft. What his daughter's caregiver did in the darkness when she thought no one was watching shattered every wall Garrett had built around his heart in the 3 years since his wife's death. He sat alone in his home office, the blue glow of the monitor lighting his face, and wept so hard his chest ached. Because sometimes the truth isn't what breaks us. Sometimes it's realizing we've been wrong about everything that matters. Garrett Sullivan was 38 years old and had made his fortune as a tech investor in Silicon Valley, turning early bets on artificial intelligence startups into a portfolio worth $47 million. But all the money in the world hadn't saved his wife Emma when a drunk driver ran a red light on a Wednesday afternoon 3 years ago. Emma died instantly. Their daughter Kennedy, 8 years old now but only 5 then, survived with injuries that left her with severe cerebral palsy. Wheelchair-bound, limited speech, requiring 24-hour care for the rest of her life. Garrett's grief had transformed into something darker over those 3 years, something controlling and paranoid and corrosive. He'd fired 7 caregivers in 18 months for infractions so minor they bordered on absurd. One for being 5 minutes late due to traffic. Another because Kennedy cried once during a diaper change. Another for checking her phone during her lunch break. The truth was, Garrett didn't trust anyone with Kennedy because trusting people to keep his family safe had already failed him once in the most catastrophic way possible. When he hired Amara Okoye, he had already decided she would fail too. 45 years old, Nigerian immigrant with impeccable references and 20 years of experience caring for children with complex medical needs. She had a calm, steady demeanor that should have reassured him, but instead made him suspicious. Why was she so calm? What was she hiding? What would she do when she thought no one was watching? So Garrett did what controlling, paranoid, broken men with unlimited resources do. He installed hidden cameras throughout his home, every room, every angle, legal, disclosed to Amara as required by California law, framed as standard security measures to protect Kennedy's safety. But that wasn't why he installed them. He installed them because he was hunting for proof that his paranoia was justified, that eventually, inevitably, Amara would do something wrong, and he'd catch her and fire her, and prove once again that the only person who could protect Kennedy was him. Every night after Amara's shift ended, Garrett sat in his home office reviewing footage like a detective, searching for evidence of a crime that hadn't been committed yet. Before we continue, if you believe that, sometimes our deepest fears blind us to the most profound goodness. Subscribe to Love is Kindness. Now tell us, have you ever been so afraid of being hurt again that you pushed away the very help you needed? Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Week 1 began with Garrett sitting in his darkened office every evening, reviewing footage frame by frame like a prosecutor building a case against a defendant he'd already convicted in his mind. Amara was flawless. Patient when Kennedy grew frustrated during therapy exercises, gentle when Kennedy's muscles spasmed unexpectedly, professional in every interaction, every moment, every decision. But Garrett kept watching, kept searching for the inevitable flaw, the crack in the facade, the moment when her true character would reveal itself and prove that his paranoia had been protection all along. Day 3 brought the first moment that should have told him everything, but grief and fear had made him blind to anything except suspicion. 7 a.m., morning routine. Kennedy trapped in the prison of her own body and furious about it, hitting her wheelchair tray with the limited motor control she possessed, her nonverbal sounds communicating frustration that most caregivers met with strained patience that barely concealed their own irritation. Garrett leaned forward, watching the monitor, waiting for Amara to snap, to show impatience, to reveal that caring for a disabled child was a job she tolerated rather than chose. Instead, Amara began singing. Softly, under her breath, a Nigerian lullaby in Yoruba that her own mother had sung to her 40 years ago in a village outside Lagos. Kennedy went completely still, her small hands freezing mid-strike, her head turning toward the sound like a flower finding sun. Garrett made a note in his surveillance log. Using distraction techniques, acceptable but impersonal, standard caregiver training, he missed entirely what the footage actually showed, that Amara was giving Kennedy pieces of her own childhood, her own mother's love, translated across continents and languages into a moment of pure connection. Day 5, 6 p.m. Amara's shift officially ended, and the time clock in the kitchen recorded her clocking out at precisely 6:02. Never late, always professional, always by the book. Garrett watched her gather her bag, put on her coat, and then instead of walking out the front door to the guest house where she lived, she turned back. Walked to Kennedy's room, spent 45 unpaid minutes helping Kennedy with the physical therapy exercises the occupational therapist had prescribed, gentle stretches and movements designed to prevent muscle contractures, work that was tedious and time-consuming and not technically Amara's responsibility once her shift ended. Garrett's paranoia spiked immediately. Why would she stay? What does she want? Is she building a case for demanding more money? Is she trying to make herself indispensable so I can't fire her? The possibility that Amara stayed simply because she cared, because watching Kennedy make even incremental progress mattered more to her than being paid for every minute of her time, never entered his mind. Day 8 brought the phone call that nearly ended Amara's employment before the truth could break through Garrett's carefully constructed walls of suspicion. Amara on her lunch break in the kitchen, speaking rapid Yoruba into her phone, her voice animated in ways it never was during work hours, her face showing emotions Garrett had never seen her express. He couldn't understand a single word. Every syllable in a language he didn't speak felt like a threat, like evidence of some conspiracy being conducted in code specifically designed to exclude him from knowledge that might protect his daughter. His mind supplied a dozen terrible translations. She's complaining about Kennedy. She's mocking me to friends. She's planning something. He made a note in his log. Consider termination. Possible communication concerns. He never discovered that Amara was talking to her sister back in Lagos, describing Kennedy's progress, asking for advice about traditional Nigerian games that might help with Kennedy's fine motor skills, weeping quietly because Kennedy's smile that morning had reminded her so achingly of her daughter Blessing's smile. Week 2 brought patterns Garrett observed but fundamentally misunderstood because he was watching through a lens ground and polished by grief into an instrument that distorted everything it touched. Amara began bringing homemade food, jollof rice and egusi soup and moi moi, Nigerian dishes from her childhood that she made in the guest house kitchen after her shifts ended. Kennedy, who'd refused most foods for months, who'd made mealtimes into battlegrounds of resistance, ate. Actually ate, opened her mouth willingly for spoonfuls of food that tasted like love and effort and connection. Garrett noted it, attempting to create dependency through food, possible concern. He missed that Amara was feeding Kennedy the same dishes she'd fed Blessing, that every meal was an act of resurrection, bringing her dead daughter back to life through the child in front of her, who also deserved to be nourished, not just physically, but emotionally. Amara spent her lunch breaks on her phone, but not making calls, researching. Videos about cerebral palsy exercises, forums where parents and caregivers shared what worked and what didn't, scientific papers about neuroplasticity and childhood development, building a library of knowledge that had nothing to do with her paycheck and everything to do with the fact that she saw Kennedy not as a patient to be managed, but as a child with potential to be unlocked. Garrett saw the screen time in the footage logs and noted, excessive personal phone use during breaks. Discuss appropriate boundaries. He never asked what she was researching, never gave her the chance to explain that she was spending her free time becoming a better caregiver for his daughter without being asked, without being paid, without expecting anything except the privilege of watching Kennedy grow. And through it all, Amara talked to Kennedy constantly. Not baby talk or the simplified speech people use with those they assume can't understand, but real conversation, describing what she was doing and why, asking Kennedy questions even though Kennedy couldn't answer verbally, treating her like the intelligent 8-year-old child she was instead of a collection of medical needs wrapped in damaged neurology. Garrett watched this and wondered, why is she trying so hard? What's her angle? The possibility that Amara's angle was simply loving a child who deserved love never penetrated his paranoid calculations. Then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything. 2 a.m. Kennedy's scream cutting through the darkness, terror given voice through limited vocal cords, a sound Garrett had learned meant nightmare. The ones where Kennedy relived the car accident in fragments her conscious mind couldn't articulate, but her sleeping brain couldn't forget. Garrett was already moving, already halfway out of bed, when decades of surveillance instinct made him grab his phone first. Check the camera, see what's happening before you respond. What he saw at 2:17 a.m. destroyed every wall he'd built between himself and the possibility of trusting another human being with the things that mattered most. Amara entered Kennedy's room, not from the hallway but from the back door, meaning she'd been in the guest house, heard Kennedy through the baby monitor Garrett had installed, and run across the dark yard in her nightgown and bare feet to reach a child who wasn't biologically hers, whose care wasn't technically her responsibility in the middle of the night, who she could have let cry until the father who'd installed cameras everywhere finally noticed and responded. Kennedy was tangled in blankets, crying that terrible, frustrated crying of someone trapped in a body that wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't let her escape even nightmare horrors. Garrett expected standard protocol: untangle the blankets, turn on the light, reassure with professional distance, leave once calm was restored. But Amara did something else entirely. She lifted Kennedy from the bed with infinite gentleness, cradling her against her chest like Kennedy weighed nothing, when in reality Kennedy was 8 years old and 46 pounds of dead weight that required strength to carry safely. She walked to the corner of the room where the old rocking chair sat, the one Emma had rocked Kennedy in as a baby, the one Garrett couldn't bear to move or sit in because it held too many ghosts. Amara sat down in Emma's chair, wrapped Kennedy in her arms, and began to sing. Not the Nigerian lullaby this time, but "You Are My Sunshine," the song Emma had sung to Kennedy every night from birth until the night before the accident, the song Garrett hadn't been able to hear for 3 years without his throat closing and his chest collapsing under the weight of everything he'd lost. Kennedy's crying stopped instantly, immediately, like a switch had been thrown. She nestled into Amara's chest, her small body finally relaxing, finally safe, finally held the way children are supposed to be held when fear makes the world too large and too dark. And Amara kept singing, rocking in Emma's chair, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking around the words but never stopping. "I know you miss your mama, sweet girl. I know. I lost my daughter too. She was your age, 8 years old. Malaria, back home in Nigeria before I came to America. That's why I do this work. That's why I stay late. That's why I sing to you. Because somewhere, I like to think someone would have held my blessing like this if she was scared at night. And because you deserve to be loved, Kennedy. Not just cared for. Loved." Garrett sat in his office, the blue glow of the monitor still illuminating his face, hours after the footage ended, watching this woman he'd been hunting for mistakes, this woman he'd surveilled and suspected and planned to fire, holding his daughter with the exact tenderness Emma used to show, singing Emma's song, loving Kennedy not because a paycheck required it or professional duty demanded it, but because her own grief had taught her something Garrett had forgotten in 3 years of paranoid protection, that holding a child who'd lost her mother was sacred, that love wasn't something you could schedule or supervise or control, that sometimes the people you trust least are the ones loving your child most. The revelation hit him with the force of the drunk driver's car that had destroyed his family 3 years ago. He'd hired 7 caregivers before Amara, fired all of them for being inadequate. But they hadn't been inadequate at their jobs. They'd been inadequate replacements for Emma. He'd been firing them for not being his dead wife, for not loving Kennedy with a ghost's impossible perfection, for not filling the hole in his daughter's life that nothing and no one could fill except time and grief and new forms of love he'd been too broken to recognize or allow. He'd told himself he was protecting Kennedy from potential harm, from negligence or abuse or the 1,000 ways the world could hurt a vulnerable child. But the truth was uglier and more painful. His paranoia hadn't kept Kennedy safe. It had kept her isolated. It had prevented her from receiving the love she desperately needed, because Garrett couldn't bear to trust anyone with the most precious thing he had left after losing everything else that mattered. The morning came too slowly and too fast. Garrett waited by the kitchen window, watching for Amara to cross from the guest house at 7 a.m. like she did every morning, punctual to the minute, professional in every movement. She entered through the back door, her face showing no trace of the tears she'd cried hours earlier, no acknowledgement of the sacred moment she'd shared with Kennedy in the darkness. Professional, warm with Kennedy. Acting like 2:17 a.m. had never happened, like Garrett hadn't witnessed the most profound act of love his daughter had received since Emma died. Garrett intercepted her before she could begin the morning routine. "I need to talk to you." Amara's face shifted immediately, professional warmth replaced by professional guardedness, the mask every employee learns to wear when a boss says those words. "If this is about last night, Mr. Sullivan," she said carefully, her accent slightly thicker when she was nervous, "I apologize for overstepping. It won't happen again. I should have waited for you to respond to Kennedy's distress. It was inappropriate for me to enter her room during non-working hours without your explicit permission." "No," Garrett said, his voice breaking around the word like ice cracking under pressure it could no longer support. "I need to apologize to you." Amara's professional mask flickered, confusion breaking through years of experience teaching her that employers apologize to staff approximately never, that power flows one direction and accountability flows the opposite way. Garrett forced himself to continue, to speak truths that made him feel exposed and ashamed and smaller than he'd felt since the hospital social worker had explained that Kennedy would never walk again, never speak clearly, never have the life Emma had dreamed for her. "I installed cameras throughout this house. You knew that. I disclosed it legally. But what I didn't tell you was why. It wasn't about Kennedy's safety. It was about my inability to trust anyone after the world took my wife and destroyed my daughter's body and taught me that safety is an illusion we tell ourselves to survive the terror of loving people we could lose." He took a breath, forced himself to meet Amara's eyes, those dark eyes that had seen Kennedy with perfect clarity when Garrett had been too blinded by fear to see anything except potential threats. "I've been watching you for 2 weeks, every moment, every interaction, looking for reasons to fire you, looking for proof that you'd hurt my daughter the way the world hurt her when it took her mother, looking for evidence that my paranoia was protection instead of poison." Amara stood perfectly still, her face unreadable, years of being scrutinized and judged and found wanting by people with power, teaching her not to react until she understood where the blow would land. "Last night," Garrett continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, breaking in places where grief had been buried but never processed, "I watched you hold my daughter the way her mother used to hold her. I watched you sing Emma's song, the one I haven't been able to hear for 3 years without feeling like I'm drowning. And I heard what you said to Kennedy. I heard you tell her about your daughter, about blessing." Amara's professional mask shattered completely. "You heard that?" she whispered, and it wasn't a question but a confession, a secret she'd kept locked in the guest house where cameras didn't reach and grief could be private. "Every word," Garrett confirmed. "And I need you to know something. I installed those cameras to catch you doing something wrong. I watched every moment hoping to find proof that you were inadequate or dangerous or secretly planning to hurt my daughter. But instead, I caught you doing everything right. I caught you loving my daughter when I'd forgotten how, when I'd been so focused on protecting her from potential harm that I'd prevented her from receiving actual love." Amara's eyes filled with tears. She'd learned to control during work hours, professional boundaries she maintained because showing emotion made employers uncomfortable, made them question your competence, made them wonder if you were too invested in children who weren't yours to love. "Mr. Sullivan," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall, "I don't do this job because it pays well. It doesn't. I do it because my blessing never got to grow up. She died at 8 years old from malaria in Nigeria before I came to America, before I could give her the medical care that might have saved her, before she could become whoever she was supposed to be. And every child I care for, every 8-year-old girl who needs someone to rock her when she's scared at night, that's me giving my daughter the childhood I couldn't. That's me loving the children I can still reach, because I'll never hold the one I lost. Kennedy doesn't need a caregiver who follows a schedule and administers medications and documents therapy progress. She needs someone who sees her, really sees her, not as a collection of medical needs or disabilities or limitations, but as a child who lost her mother and survived a trauma and deserves to be loved anyway. Garrett felt something break open in his chest. 3 years of grief he'd transformed into paranoia and control, finally cracking under the weight of meeting someone whose grief had transformed into something else entirely. Something that healed instead of harmed, something that loved instead of suspected. "I don't want you to be Kennedy's caregiver anymore," he said. Amara's face fell, resignation settling into features that had learned disappointment was inevitable when you loved other people's children too much. "I understand," she said quietly, already calculating how long she could stay in the guest house while finding new employment, already preparing to leave another child she'd grown to love because love made employers uncomfortable. But Garrett wasn't finished. "I want you to be her family," he continued, his voice gaining strength from finally speaking truth instead of fear. "Move out of the guest house. Take the room next to Kennedy's, not as staff, not as an employee, as someone who loves her. Because that's what you've been doing all along, and I was too broken to see it. I've spent 3 years trying to protect Kennedy from the world, but the world isn't what's been hurting her. My inability to let anyone love her has been hurting her. You've been loving my daughter in the darkness when you thought no one was watching, and it's the most extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed." Amara looked at Kennedy, who sat in her wheelchair between them, watching with those intelligent 8-year-old eyes that understood more than her limited speech could express. Kennedy's right hand, the one with slightly more motor control, lifted slowly from her wheelchair tray, moved through space with deliberate effort that every small movement required, reached toward Amara, the first intentional gesture she'd made toward anyone who wasn't Garrett since Emma died, since the accident taught her that the world was dangerous and love could disappear without warning. Amara took Kennedy's hand, tears finally spilling over professional boundaries that no longer mattered, and Kennedy's fingers curled around hers with whatever grip strength cerebral palsy had left her. "Yes," Amara whispered, looking at Garrett through tears, then back at Kennedy. "I'll stay. Not as a caregiver, as family." 1 year later, the house that had been a tomb filled with surveillance equipment and paranoid protection transformed into something resembling home. Kennedy's vocabulary had expanded from frustrated sounds to 3 clear words she worked endlessly to pronounce. Mama Amara. Not replacing Emma. Never replacing Emma. But adding to Kennedy's understanding of what mother meant, what love looked like, who showed up in darkness and sang you back to safety. Amara had legally become Kennedy's godmother in a small ceremony in Garrett's living room, witnessed by the social worker who'd spent 3 years worried about Kennedy's isolation, and was now documenting her progress with joy. They celebrated Kennedy's 9th birthday together, the 3 of them, with Emma's photo on the wall, honored but not haunting, present but not preventing new love from growing in soil fertilized by old grief. Garrett had removed all the cameras except the safety monitor in Kennedy's room, the one that let Amara hear if Kennedy needed her in the night, the one that documented love instead of hunting for betrayal. Garrett installed cameras to catch someone hurting his daughter. Instead, he caught someone healing her. And in the process, all 3 of them learned that family isn't just who you're born to or who shares your blood or who the world tells you should matter. Sometimes family is who shows up at 2 a.m. in bare feet in a nightgown because a child is scared. Sometimes it's who sings your dead wife's song because a daughter needs to be held. Sometimes it's who loves your child, not because employment requires it, but because their own loss taught them how sacred it is to love children who remain when your own is gone. Sometimes the people we trust least are the ones who deserve our trust most. And sometimes grief doesn't have to transform into paranoia. Sometimes, if you're very lucky, grief can transform into a different kind of family entirely. Stories like this happen when we choose trust over fear, when we let love surprise us in unexpected forms. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone you were certain you couldn't trust, only to discover they were exactly who you needed all along? Comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10. Sometimes the hardest part isn't opening our homes, it's opening our hearts to the possibility that we might still be wrong about what safety actually means.